Welcome to another deep dive. I'm your guide through the labyrinth of global information.
And I'm here alongside you. It's Monday, June 23rd, 2025.
And, well, we've processed a vast amount of global developments, really sifted through the noise.
Exactly. To distill the most critical insights for you. Our mission, as always, is to provide that direct route to being truly well-informed.
Packed with, surprising facts, maybe some unexpected connections, and just enough clarity to keep you hooked and thinking.
Absolutely. Today, we're starting with a crucial journey, looking at the rapidly escalating tensions in the Middle East.
Right. We'll be diving deep into those significant U.S. airstrikes on Iran.
And exploring the immediate global ripple effects,
Yeah.
oil markets, international air travel, the whole picture,
Then we're going to pivot.
to the intricate dynamics of global economics. We'll examine the ongoing U.S.-China trade and tech wars.
Yeah, from things like copper supply chains, which are more foundational than you might think, and the surprising impact of new e-commerce tariffs.
All the way to the critical semiconductor industry. The tech that underpins pretty much everything.
We'll also touch upon the European Union's evolving and, I'd say, increasingly firm trade stance with China.
And India's urgent quest for a U.S. trade deal. That deadline is looming.
And finally, a really fascinating story. A precedent-setting lawsuit between the BBC and a prominent AI company.
That one could have huge implications down the line.
Definitely. So settle in. Let's unravel these complexities.
Let's do it.
Okay, part one. The Middle East in flux. U.S. strikes and beyond.
Right.
Let's unpack this immediately because, well, the biggest headline, the most impactful one over the weekend, definitely came from the Middle East.
No question.
The United States has carried out significant airstrikes against Iran. And this move has sent, well, shockwaves across the geopolitical landscape. It's amplified global anxieties.
And these weren't just any strikes, were they? They were precision targets.
Exactly. Executed with a clear objective, though maybe a potentially temporary one, it speaks volumes about current U.S. policy.
So the timing and the targets, you said they're crucial.
Absolutely crucial. Gives you a window into the strategic intent. These strikes happened around 2:30 a.m. local time, Middle East time, on Sunday, June 22nd.
Okay. And the targets.
3 Iranian nuclear facilities, foundational to their entire program. We're talking Natanz.
The main enrichment site. Yeah.
Fordo, which is that
Yeah.
deeply buried facility, carved into a mountain, designed to withstand attack.
Right. Always a major concern, that one. Very hard to monitor.
And the Isfahan uranium conversion facility.
So hitting those 3 specifically,
Right.
it really looks like an attempt to cripple their ability to produce highly enriched uranium.
Severely cripple, if not, dismantle it entirely, at least for a while.
And the hardware involved, what did they use?
Well, the scale and the technological sophistication are pretty striking. B-2 stealth bombers were involved.
Those iconic Batwing planes.
Right. Some reportedly launching all the way from Whiteman Air Force Base in Missouri.
Wow, that's global reach. Shows how
Mm.
quickly they can deploy.
And alongside them, nuclear-powered submarines, implying, a broad strategic reach, covert deployment.
Launching cruise missiles.
Tomahawks, conventional Tomahawk subsonic cruise missiles, aimed at Natanz and Isfahan, more for precision against shallower targets.
Okay, but Fordo, being so deep underground.
That's where the heavy hitters came in. The B-2s unleashed 6 GBU-57 massive ordnance penetrators, MOPs.
6 of them. Those are the 30,000-pound bunker busters, right?
Exactly. Each with a 5,000-pound warhead, engineered specifically to penetrate deep through reinforced concrete hardened bunkers before detonating.
Using 6 on one target like Fordo, that underscores a serious determination to get deep inside and destroy what's there.
No doubt about it.
What's also, well, unusual is the way it was confirmed.
Right. President Trump, via social media, stating targets were completely and totally obliterated.
And then signaling it was one and done, for now.
For now. Because that was immediately followed by a pretty stern warning. He threatened follow-up strikes if Iran doesn't negotiate peace or if they retaliate.
Which seems likely they would, wouldn't they?
We'll get to that. But yeah, adding another layer, his Truth Social account apparently went offline briefly right after the announcement.
Really? Sparking questions, I imagine. Cybersecurity? Something else?
Who knows? It came back online, but it just highlights how modern conflict communication can be,
Yeah.
well, as impactful and sometimes as opaque as the military action itself. Unconventional, to say the least.
And looking back, was there any deception involved? Warnings?
Strong indications of both. That prior signaling from Washington about a 2-week deliberation period looks like a charade now.
Misdirection. Like we've seen before, maybe with Israeli strikes. Signal you're not ready, then act fast.
Exactly. But complicating things, reports also suggest the U.S. did contact Iran hours before the strikes.
A warning to allow for evacuation.
Potentially. But how effective is a warning against stealth bombers hitting deep targets, especially with Iran's somewhat diminished air defenses? It's debatable.
And what was the intent? Avoid casualties. A subtle message not to escalate. Psychological ops.
Hard to say for sure. Leaves a lot of questions unanswered about the precise motive behind that heads-up.
And the actual impact. Is it clear?
Not at all. Significant uncertainty. The U.S. claims complete destruction, a major setback for Iran's nuclear program.
While Iran claims only surface-level damage, dismissing it as exaggeration.
Pretty much. And independent verification of damage to deeply buried sites is incredibly difficult, especially this soon.
But experts suggest that even if some centrifuges survived at Fordo...
Right, they might be totally inaccessible. Tunnel collapses, especially with the key parts hundreds of meters down.
So if these facilities are effectively destroyed or inoperable...
It would severely disrupt Iran's long-term ability to produce new enriched uranium or convert yellowcake. That's the processed ore, a critical early step.
Basically cutting off their supply chain for weapons-grade material at key points.
Exactly, buying time, essentially, for diplomacy or maybe more pressure.
And while this is happening, all eyes turn to Beijing.
Yeah, China's reaction, swift, but very cautious, walking a diplomatic tightrope.
It's really interesting, isn't it? Their nuanced position tells us a lot about their global strategy.
Diplomatically, they condemned it pretty clearly. Foreign ministry called it a violation of international law, said it exacerbates tensions.
And urged everyone, especially Israel, they said, to stop hostilities.
Right. And at the UN Security Council emergency meeting, their ambassador criticized Washington's unilateral military actions as a heavy blow to nonproliferation.
Strong words. Fits their stance against unilateralism, pushing for a multipolar world.
But despite the strong rhetoric, not much willingness to actually intervene beyond diplomacy.
The state-run Global Times warned about the MOPs pushing things toward an uncontrollable state.
Which is quite a statement.
But Xi Jinping, in a call with Putin, just reiterated calls for restraint, didn't directly condemn Israel.
That's a careful balancing act, prioritizing their own national interests, it seems.
And they showed that with the evacuations, right? Getting over 1,800 Chinese nationals out of Iran, hundreds from Israel.
Definitely a risk-averse approach. Protect their own, signal non-combatant status, avoid getting entangled.
This whole conflict, though, it really presents a double-edged sword for China.
How so? Potential opportunities, but also grave risks.
Exactly. On one hand, if the U.S. gets bogged down in the Middle East, that diverts American attention and resources away from Asia.
Particularly Taiwan. Breathing room for Beijing, perhaps?
That might be their calculation. But on the other hand, a regional war disrupting oil supplies through the Strait of Hormuz.
The economic vulnerability. Half of China's crude oil imports pass through there.
A staggering amount. Any disruption could severely impact their energy security, derail their economic recovery. As one analyst put it, China would be hit hardest outside the region if Hormuz closes.
That's a huge risk hanging over them.
And these events also expose the limits of China's influence, don't they?
Yeah, their regional ambitions brokering that Iran-Saudi détente in 2023, expanding the Belt and Road.
All depends on stability. But now, when it really matters, they're struggling to be a credible mediator.
Risking looking impotent on the international stage, as some reports suggest, if they can't leverage their relationships to de-escalate.
It could be a massive double diplomatic and economic hit. Shows the difficulty of translating economic clout into real geopolitical influence when things get hot.
Which brings us directly to the economic heart of this.
Yeah.
The Strait of Hormuz.
Right. Because even if China struggles to mediate, its economic vulnerability is undeniable. And it's fascinating how quickly military moves translate into economic shifts.
The world's most vital oil transit route. Instantly the focus of global economic concern.
Over 20% of the world's oil. 20 million barrels a day. Through that narrow choke point.
Any disruption sends tremors worldwide. Gas pumps, industry, everything feels it.
And the market reaction was immediate. Oil prices surged right after the strikes.
U.S. West Texas Intermediate WTI jumped 2.7% to $75.80 a barrel.
Brent crude rose over 2.4%, briefly spiking above $81.
That reflects pure geopolitical risk. Markets are pricing in a risk premium for more escalation.
The big fear is Iran retaliating by closing or disrupting the strait. That could send prices soaring. $100, maybe $130 a barrel.
Which risks a global recession, far worse than the post-pandemic slowdown we saw.
Even a temporary disruption would roil markets for weeks. Inflationary pressure, economic instability, it's serious.
And China's vulnerability, as you mentioned, is extreme. They buy most of Iran's 1.8 million barrels per day exports.
They'd be severely impacted, which is why U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio explicitly warned Iran,
calling blocking the waterway a declaration of war and economic suicide for Iran itself.
and urging China to use its influence to dissuade Tehran highlights that interconnectedness, that fragile balance.
Economic interdependence as a force for stability, maybe, but a precarious one.
Absolutely. So the oil market is now pricing in that risk premium. Serious concern out there.
And Iran's response? Their foreign minister said all options were on the table.
And the Revolutionary Guard warned U.S. bases in the region are vulnerable. Both the U.S. and Israel are anticipating major retaliation, taking precautions.
There were even early reports, though scant on details, of missile hits in undisclosed locations already.
Right. Now, Iran's actual capabilities for retaliation, they probably lack the power to defeat Israel outright in a conventional sense.
But they could inflict significant damage, can't they?
Oh, yes. Israeli defense sources report low interceptor stocks for Iron Dome, David's Sling, vulnerable to saturation attacks.
And Iran has shown they can coordinate large-scale missiles and drone strikes, overwhelm defenses, at least temporarily.
Even if the U.S. strikes degraded some capabilities, they likely held some back. Combined ballistic missiles with hundreds, maybe thousands of drones.
They can still deliver real damage, military sites, infrastructure.
Plus their proxies. The Houthis, Hezbollah, Qaeda Hezbollah in Iraq, they've all threatened direct responses if the U.S. gets involved.
So Red Sea shipping attacks could restart. That has global implications.
Severe implications. Raising costs, transit times, and while an attack on the U.S. homeland is less likely...
Distance, defenses.
Right. But maybe a symbolic strike. Cyber. Not inconceivable, though its impact on U.S. warfighting would be minimal.
What about the internal dynamics in Iran? Reports of disarray.
Yeah, command and control reportedly hit hard. Ayatollah Khamenei, said to be ill with cancer, accelerating succession planning, deputizing new leaders quickly as old ones were, quote, wiped out.
Facing strong public opposition, internal divisions. They're in a tough spot.
A very precarious position. They might feel forced to pick their poison. Retaliation could seem like the least worst option.
To appease hardliners, save face after heavy losses, rather than negotiate peace immediately.
Exactly. A truce without a strong, visible retaliation could outrage the hardliners, crucial for the regime's survival. Might lead to internal instability, which could be even more dangerous for them than external conflict. Adds another layer of unpredictability.
And beyond the immediate military and oil market reactions, there are broader disruptions happening already.
Air traffic, for one. Airlines scrambling.
British Airways, Singapore Airlines suspended flights to Dubai, intensifying disruption.
Over 150 carriers had already rerouted or suspended flights over Israel, Iraq, Jordan.
And while airspace over Iran, Iraq, Syria is technically clear for now, rerouting over Saudi Arabia and Egypt is the new norm.
Adding flight times, fuel costs, disrupting schedules, especially tough for European airlines already avoiding Russian airspace.
It compounds their challenges significantly.
Regional oil producers are also watching nervously. Iraq, OPEC's number 2, is vulnerable to spillover violence.
Saudi Arabia, officially neutral, expressing deep concern. Understandably.
And while the International Energy Agency assures us global supplies are stable for now, with 1.2 billion barrels in emergency reserves.
That specter of broader regional instability keeps energy prices on edge.
Definitely. Now, the big question people ask, is this World War II?
Privately, experts, analysts, anyone tracking this is, well, knocking on all the available wood, as the source said.
And the answer, cautiously, is not for now, no.
Despite the gravity, the destructive power, it's still orders of magnitude short of a world war.
Iran can hurt the U.S. and Israel short term, but lacks resources for a protracted, large-scale war alone.
And its proxies might cause local trouble, but no major power seems ready to jump in on Iran's side.
China, as we discussed, simply doesn't care that much to intervene militarily there.
Russia's focused on Ukraine, can't spare significant resources. No one else is lining up.
So, not World War II, but...
But it is undoubtedly one of the defining crises of the 21st century, a stark reminder of the fragile balance of power, the constant potential for global disruption.
Well said.
Okay, let's shift gears. Part 2. The U.S., China, and Europe. Trade, tech, and tariffs.
Right, and building on those geopolitical ripples, we see how they intertwine with existing economic fault lines. If you connect this to the bigger picture, critical minerals, commodity supply chains, they've become a central battleground in the U.S.-China trade war.
And the U.S. is definitely accelerating efforts to bring those key supply chains closer to home. We've been tracking this strategic shift.
It's manifesting in fascinating ways, especially around copper, a metal far more critical than many realize.
We're seeing surging demand, but lagging supply.
Exactly. The current U.S. administration signed executive orders to protect and boost domestic copper production. This push comes just as global demand is soaring.
Driven by electrification, green tech EVs, renewables, electronics, all need tons of copper.
But supply is struggling. Global mine production is expected to peak in 2026. We're looking at a projected 700,000-ton deficit in 2025 alone.
Wow, that's a huge gap. Chronic underinvestment in mines, disruptions from the trade war.
Both a classic supply-demand imbalance amplified by strategic competition, and it's compounded by China's dominance.
How dominant are they?
They control roughly 50% of global copper smelting capacity. Astonishing.
That gives Beijing immense leverage over the whole supply chain, strategic vulnerability for other nations.
Which makes developing domestic production and processing in the U.S. and allied nations incredibly strategic, almost national security.
So companies like Giant Mining, they're getting attention in this context.
Precisely. They operate a silver-copper-gold project in Nevada, a top-ranked mining jurisdiction.
And that February 14th executive order implicitly prioritized copper, signaling government support.
Right. Giant Mining reported its best-ever drill intercepts last September, indicating potentially significant deposits. Their balance sheet is funded for 2025 drilling.
Their CEO made some strong comments about a specific drill hole.
David Greenway, yeah. On drill hole MHB34, he said, quote, "In my entire career, I've never seen drill core like this. It's truly extraordinary."
Strong words.
He added that visible native copper beyond 1,850 feet reinforces their belief it's evolving into a world-class copper, silver, and gold discovery.
Now, obviously, it's a speculative play. Early-stage mining always is.
High risk, absolutely. But market turmoil has hit its share price, down 50% since February. Some analysts might see that as a potentially very cheap pick for those tracking strategic minerals. Illustrates how these macro shifts create opportunities, sometimes volatile ones.
Interesting. Okay, shifting from raw materials to consumer goods.
Yeah.
U.S. tariffs on low-value packages from China. That's causing disruption, too.
Significant disruption, impacting giants like Shein and Temu. The data from Chinese customs is striking.
A dramatic decline.
Yeah. Small parcel exports to the U.S. fell to just over $1 billion in May. That's a sharp 40% year-on-year contraction, lowest since early 2023.
40%. That's not a dip. That's a plunge.
It represents a fundamental reevaluation of trade routes, business models.
And it coincides directly with the U.S. closing that de minimis loophole.
Exactly. That loophole allowed packages under $800 and duty-free, bypassing extensive customs. It was heavily used, some say abused, by Chinese e-commerce firms shipping direct to consumers.
Avoiding tariffs, traditional import channels.
Right. But as of May 2nd, parcels from China and Hong Kong face tariffs up to 54%. Drastically increases costs, erases their competitive edge.
So it's upending their business models. Shein hiking prices.
Both Shein and Temu saw double-digit sales drops right after the new duties hit. Smaller exporters operating on thin margins are hit particularly hard.
But the U.S. is still technically the top destination.
It is, which shows how integrated things were. But it clearly suggests Chinese exporters are shifting focus. Facing hit margins in the U.S., they're moving products elsewhere, Belgium, South Korea, Hungary, where demand is still strong.
A rapid recalibration of global supply chains, digital trade routes, pushing diversification.
Precisely.
And this isn't just a U.S.-China issue. The EU is getting tougher, too.
Yes, the European Union announced over the weekend it's excluding Chinese companies from bidding on certain government contracts.
For medical devices, right. Over 5 million euros.
That's the threshold. It's a significant move, signaling Europe's growing assertiveness towards Beijing.
And the reason? Lack of reciprocal market access in China.
That's the official line. It's the first enforcement action under their new International Procurement Instrument, the IPI, designed to ensure fair access globally.
So, under this rule, successful bids for these medical device tenders can't contain more than 50% Chinese devices.
Correct. Though some exemptions might be possible. The Commission says it aims to level the playing field, arguing European companies face systemic barriers in China.
Their investigation found what? 87% of Chinese public procurement in medical devices was closed to EU firms?
Between 2015 and 2023, yeah, due to exclusionary and discriminatory practices, opaque tenders, domestic content rules, preferential treatment,
While over the same period, Chinese medical device exports to the EU more than doubled.
creating a huge imbalance. That asymmetry is exactly what Brussels is targeting, moving from talk to action.
And this follows those clashes over EV tariffs, the Chinese probe into European brandy. Tit for tat.
It seems like an escalation. Brussels is signaling intolerance for these asymmetric trade practices, especially in sensitive sectors like healthcare and tech, critical for national resilience.
Have they left the door open for China to address concerns?
They have. Said measures could be suspended or withdrawn if China opens its markets, but Beijing pushed back hard.
Calling it protectionist.
Yeah, accusing Europe of unfair practices. But it really underscores Europe's broader shift toward economic defensiveness, re-evaluating its open market approach.
Some analysts calling it another nail in the coffin for the EU-China trade relationship.
It suggests a growing alignment, maybe, between U.S. and EU strategies in confronting China's economic policies, especially since the EU is China's second biggest market after the U.S.
And on the tech front, the U.S.-China tech war, still intensifying, especially around semiconductors.
Very much so. The Trump administration is reportedly weighing a really controversial move.
Revoking those long-standing waivers, the ones allowing Samsung, SK Hynix, TSMC to supply their Chinese factories with U.S. chip-making gear.
Without needing individual licenses each time, yeah. Revoking those would fundamentally change how these critical companies operate in China.
That could seriously disrupt global semiconductor supply chains, which are already so fragile.
And strain ties with key allies, South Korea and Taiwan, who are also vital investors in America's own chip-making sector. It's complicated.
Who's proposing this?
Reportedly Jeffrey Kessler, a Commerce Department official overseeing export controls, framing it as curtailing China's access to sensitive U.S. tech, especially advanced manufacturing.
But the factories involved, like Samsung's and Xi'an, they mostly make legacy chips, right? Older tech.
Primarily, yes. Used in consumer electronics, cars, industrial machinery. But any slowdown or halt there, even in legacy chips, could ripple through global markets. Shortages, price hikes for everyday stuff.
The U.S. says it's about aligning systems with China's own licensing for critical minerals.
But industry insiders worry Beijing could see it as breaching that recent U.S.-China trade truce agreed in London, potentially reigniting broader hostilities.
So Samsung, TSMC, SK Hynix are lobbying against it.
Actively. Notified their governments, lobbying Washington, highlighting the huge economic impact.
While national security hawks argue for stronger restrictions, hinder China's tech ambitions, drive supply chain diversification away from China, even if it hurts allies short term.
That's the tension. Economic interests versus national security imperatives. The outcome's undecided, adding fresh uncertainty to an already fragile semiconductor trade landscape.
Just yet another salvo in the ongoing U.S.-China technology war.
Indeed.
Okay, part 3, global economic updates and the AI frontier.
Right, and expanding on those global trade dynamics, India is another major player regionally grappling with these shifts.
Because President Trump's global tariffs are set to retake effect July 9th.
Exactly. And India is scrambling to finalize a trade deal to potentially avoid a punitive 26% levy on exports to the U.S., its largest trade partner. The pressure is immense.
Sparking intense diplomatic activity. They're hoping for a fast-track deal, maybe like the one they did with the U.K.
That seems to be the goal. India's free trade agreement with the U.K., its first with a major Western economy, is the template.
That one slashed tariffs on 90% of U.K. imports, granted Indian exporters significant access.
After 3 years of negotiations, yeah, it shows how India might navigate complex U.S. demands, lower auto tariffs, digital trade liberalization, stricter IP rules. It demonstrated a new pragmatism from India.
But replicating that with the Trump administration, highly uncertain.
Very uncertain. Given the administration's unpredictable approach, remember, they announced a first tranche of a U.S.-India pact back in February during Modi's visit, but little concrete progress on the broader deal since then.
And other hurdles exist too. The EU insisting on carbon taxes, sustainability standards in their talks.
Which India sees as outside the scope of trade, potentially protectionist. So, significant challenges, tight timeline. But India's Commerce Secretary Sunil Bathwell remains optimistic, citing reciprocal visits, accelerated talks before July 9th.
The stakes are incredibly high for India's export sector.
Huge disruption possible without a deal. This reflects India's shift away from its traditionally protectionist stance, prioritizing domestic industry.
The UK pact signaled willingness to meet Western demands, integrate more globally, but cautiously.
Cautiously, yes, prioritizing sectors where they can compete. Textile and garment exporters are hopeful, but bracing for near-term costs without clarity from the U.S.
So the outcome of these talks really shapes India's wider Western trade ambitions, its role in the evolving global economic order.
Fundamentally shapes its future economic trajectory, its ability to attract investment.
Now, amidst all this, a new frontier is emerging rapidly. AI versus traditional industries, specifically media.
Ah, yes, the BBC lawsuit. Groundbreaking, potentially. Could set precedents for generations.
The British Broadcasting Channel, the BBC, taking its first legal step against Perplexity AI, alleging unauthorized use of its content to train models.
They claim proof Perplexity's default model was trained using BBC material.
That's the claim. They sent a strongly worded letter demanding Perplexity stop using the content, delete the data, and propose financial compensation. It signals content producers are ready to defend their IP.
This is part of that growing tension, isn't it? Traditional media versus AI developers.
Exactly. Many AI developers relied on freely available online material for training, often without explicit licenses. The BBC, being publicly funded, is under pressure to find new revenue streams, exploring licensing deals.
Protecting their valuable content, ensuring its use is monetized and recognized, especially by commercial entities. Makes sense.
But Perplexity AI, the San Francisco search engine valued at $14 billion, they deny it.
Strongly deny it, called the BBC's claims manipulative and opportunistic, asserting a fundamental misunderstanding of technology and IP law.
They argue their tech is complex, training their own models, refining outputs from Meta's Llama, offering access to OpenAI, Google, Anthropic.
Right. That layered approach makes pinning down the exact source of content very difficult. They claim they summarize and cite, not reproduce wholesale.
But the BBC has counter-allegations.
Evidence.
Compelling evidence, they say, alleging Perplexity reproduced content verbatim, even indexed recently published articles, bypassing BBC platforms entirely.
Which undermines audience trust, engagement metrics, ad revenue. And internal BBC research found 17% of Perplexity's responses with BBC content had significant factual or contextual issues, inaccuracies, misinterpretations.
Raising concerns about reputational damage for the BBC, plus clear copyright violations if content is reproduced inaccurately or without attribution.
Which the BBC also alleges often happens, summaries lacking proper attribution, harming their brand, journalistic integrity.
The implications here are enormous. Could reshape the digital landscape.
Definitely. The BBC is registering content with the U.S. Copyright Office, preparing for legal battle, seeking statutory damages.
And legal experts think this is just the beginning, first of many lawsuits between media, creative industries, and AI models.
Seems inevitable, with tens of billions of dollars on the line in potential damages and licensing fees. These fights could go on for years.
And the outcomes will fundamentally impact AI development, how models are trained, how they interact with copyright.
And redefine the global media landscape, how information is created, distributed, consumed, valued, potentially for generations. It's a battle over the future of creativity and knowledge itself.
So what does this all mean for you, our curious listener? We've covered a lot today.
A landscape rife with geopolitical tensions, economic recalculations, rapid technological leaps.
Those immediate flashpoints in the Middle East, the complex strategic moves.
To the quieter but equally impactful shifts in global trade and that emerging AI frontier. The world's in constant motion.
Demanding our attention, our understanding.
Which raises an important question, I think. As we observe these patterns predict trajectories, how might these interconnected conflicts, these emerging tech shifts,
How might they redefine not just global power dynamics,
but the very nature of information and truth in the coming decades? Especially as AI evolves its own understanding, its role in shaping what we see and believe.
It's definitely a thought worth mulling over.
Absolutely.
Well, that's it for today's deep dive. We hope you found these insights valuable, maybe illuminating.
If you appreciated this deep dive, please do consider liking this update, subscribing to our channel, maybe even contributing to our GoFundMe page.
Your support really helps us continue to explore the world's most interesting currents, bring you these analyses.
Until next time.
Stay curious and keep learning.